Thanks for joining us, whether you're in person or joining us on Zoom tonight. Before we really get started with our program this evening, I'd like to invite up Howie Goldberg, who is going to say a word on behalf of Brotherhood about the Yellow Candle program that is getting started this year.
Thank you, Rabbi. Nice to see everybody. Brotherhood has decided to purchase and distribute yellow candles this year in memory of the Holocaust. We're happy that LIZKOR committee is working with us. Every member of the congregation is going to get a yellow candle. Some of you picked them up at the Brotherhood breakfast on Sunday. If you take one tonight, I just ask that I get your name so that we don't deliver two to the same person. So obviously it's a yellow candle. It's a typical yahrzeit candle. It will burn for 24 hours. It's yellow to commemorate the yellow stars that the Jews were forced to wear during World War II and the Holocaust. The program was started over 40 years ago by the Federation of Jewish Men's Clubs, which is a conservative group of brotherhoods. We call them brotherhoods, they call them men's clubs. And several temples in the community, in Temple Israel and Natick, I know does it. I think Beth Shalom in Framingham was doing it. I don't know if they still are. Temple Isaiah, Temple, I can't remember the one in Lexington, but there's a temple in Lexington that's doing it as well. Yeah. So Brotherhood purchased the candles. We'll be distributing them to everybody. The idea is that you have these in your home. You light them April 17th, I believe, is Yom HaShoah, and they will burn for 24 hours. We hope, as part of kind of a piggyback on this program, we hope that it will trigger discussions in the home, so that people remember the Holocaust and we ensure that the younger generations are aware of what happened. We don't want to traumatize people, but obviously it's important that we remember. As it says on here, Yom HaShoah, remember, never forget.
Thank you so much, Howie, and thanks to Brotherhood for getting this started in our synagogue this year. We're looking forward to distributing those candles to all of our congregants. As Howie mentioned, Yom HaShoah begins on April 17th in the evening. That is Patriots Day this year. We are hosting here at Temple Beth Am our community commemoration of Yom HaShoah, so we do hope that you'll join us on the evening of Monday, April 17th. And now we come to our main event for the evening. We're so delighted to have Anna Tucker, who is the Executive Director of the Framingham History Center, with us here this evening to talk about around the Seder Table, conducting oral histories at home. Of course, Passover is all about sharing our story, which Anna is going to share more with us about, so I'm not going to say more about that. But our LIZKOR to Remember program is all about honoring our past for future generations, and I know that that's what this evening is going to bring for us tonight as we strengthen and further our mission of the LIZKOR program. So I'm going to invite Ellie Anbinder, who is the LIZKOR committee chair, to introduce Anna tonight.
Thank you, Rabbi. So for 2 years, LIZKOR has been presenting programs about the Shoah, and we've covered many subjects, particularly stories of our community, TBA community, who have either lived through the Shoah or have family who has lived through the Shoah. We've also heard of 2 genealogical studies, and where members have looked and found family that they didn't even know existed. And we had a fascinating workshop helping congregants find their hidden or lost family history. So tonight our focus is going to be on continuing to preserve family history, and in fact we're going to learn just how to do it. LIZKOR's mission is to remember the history and pass it on to the 4th generation, that's your kids and your grandkids if you're young, and beyond. I'm very excited to present our guest speaker tonight. She is Anna Tucker, the executive director of the Framingham History Center, and an expert in the art of collecting and recording families' oral history. She's the founding curator of the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. And Anna is here with practical skills and tools to start the conversation and begin your own recording of family history. It's my pleasure to introduce Anna Tucker to our Bethlehem community here and on Zoom.
Thank you so much, Ellie and Rabbi, for the introduction and the warm welcome. And I have to be so appreciative for the warm welcome that you've given me since I've moved here. And I think the first introduction was through LIZKOR to Temple Beth Am, and I was so heartened to hear about the dedication, about the commitment to preserving oral histories for the purpose of keeping history a living memory, making sure that we never forget, making sure that these conversations, these names, these details, and these stories are interwoven into the conversations that we continue to have, and that's exactly what LIZKOR is doing, training next generations to not only know how to do it, but be passionate about the why behind it as well. So talking about conducting oral histories at home is part of my passion. It's part of what I do in my professional world and also something that I'm passionate about personally as well. And so tonight, what I want us to talk about is a little bit of a background and introduction about oral histories and how I came into this field and this career in many ways through the building of storytelling and through the conducting of oral histories. I want to talk a little bit about the what, the how, and especially the why behind oral histories. And I want to, as Ellie noted, provide practical skills. How can you get started right now being able to conduct oral histories in the home? At the end, we'll have a workshop practice, and I'd love with Bill's expert tech assistance as well to both have it in person and also over Zoom, so we'll figure out what that looks like together. And it is a very low stakes workshop as well, so it's something where we start trying out some of the questions, trying out some of the practices and the tools that we're going to learn here today. So when I talk about oral history, though, I really like to talk about it underneath the umbrella of storytelling. And storytelling is also at the heart of so much that we do within our Jewish community. And just as Rabbi and I were briefly talking about beforehand, there's almost no better time to talk about the importance of storytelling than coming up on Pesach, coming up on Passover. So the anchor of this talk today is really centering around how can we take these skills of oral history and bring them to the Seder table. So that's sort of what we're driving towards at the end of the talk. So just to begin, I guess, with my own story and my own journey to Framingham. So I'll admit I was not always planning on being a historian or being a museum director. I thought I was destined for the concert stage, so I was going to be a pianist. And I ended up going to Framingham, or excuse me, the high school in Israel, Alexander Muss High School in Israel, on a birthright scholarship. And I know many of us have gone on it, and our children have gone on it. And it was a transformational experience for me. And so while I was over there, I had so many wonderful educators, including my piano teacher, who taught me the art of opening my eyes and seeing that there are so many ways that we can tell stories. And I had been raised in the tradition of telling stories through music. That's what I was used to. And while I was in Israel, I became very invested in the art of telling stories and emotions and experiences through history as well. So I came back, I ended up receiving my undergraduate degree in history at Berry College outside of Atlanta. And right out of college, shockingly, I landed a museum job. So it was at the Museum of History and Holocaust Education at Kennesaw State University. And it was there that I started my engagement with oral history. So it's something that I learned about about in college, but I hadn't really actively been engaged with yet. So at the Museum of History and Holocaust Education, we started as a small 3-person team, and over the next 11 years that I was there, we built it into a 26-person department. So we ended up establishing the Department of Museums, Archives, and Rare Books. But the museum that was part of it from the very beginning was the Museum of History and Holocaust Education. The other museums that were involved were the Zuckerman Museum of Art, a Rare Books Museum, and I loved all of them. But really, and also where my office was the Museum of History and Holocaust Education. And while I was there, I worked with an incredibly talented team, and we established an oral history program. And the oral history program at the university was dedicated to recording the stories, the oral histories of Holocaust survivors, as well as World War II soldiers and home front workers as well. And this process brought me face to face with some of the most important people I would ever meet in my life, people who go on to be mentors and friends to me. And the process was something where I could see the immediate impact of an oral history. Because we were at a university, we would be able to record an oral history of the Holocaust survivor, and then we had a very robust education program. So we had hundreds of middle schoolers and high schoolers coming to the museum, and I could see the power of an oral history testimony in the children's reactions to those stories. I could see what it would look like when people didn't have the oral history, and I could see the connections that people would make. And so I became very invested in what is it about storytelling? What is it about an oral history that can often make an emotional connection in a way that reading a text may or may not? And so after I was at the Department of Museums, Archives, and Rare Books for 11 years, I had the extraordinary opportunity of helping to open the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience in New Orleans. And so this was a museum that originated in the mid-1980s in Utica, Mississippi. And the board of directors decided to move it to New Orleans in order to capture the tourists who weren't exactly trickling into Utica, Mississippi. And so I helped open the new museum there, and as the curator, really learning from my experience of oral histories at the Museum of History and Holocaust Education, I wanted to make sure oral histories were also an anchor at the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. So the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience spans over 300 years, 13 states, thousands of lives, everything that you could imagine. And so I had a very small amount of space in which to fit all of these stories and these experiences. There were two particular areas that I wanted to make sure that I had oral histories. One of them was in our section on World War II and the Holocaust. And actually many of the Holocaust narratives were those same friends and mentors that I had made while I was at the Museum of History and Holocaust Education. And others were from other foundations and museums that were also actively collecting oral histories. The Bremen Museum in Atlanta, the Shoah Foundation. And so it was really an amalgamation of these oral histories where people could come in and click on an experience and hear the Holocaust survivor tell their experiences. The other section that I very much wanted to make sure that I had oral histories as an anchor was in the civil rights section. So there was a section where I worked with, again, a wonderful team of historical scholars and advisors, and we had a series of oral histories that were recorded with rabbis in the American South during the civil rights movement. And we actually paired them to show different responses to similar questions, to show the variety and the variance of experiences and responses during this time period. So at the very end of my time at the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience, I also worked with the Council of American Jewish Museums, or CAJM, and it was for a grant to record oral histories of Jewish experiences during COVID. And it also, I think, starts the conversation about oral histories are something that we need to continually be capturing. A lot of times we think about history and we think back then, or we think way back. And the oral histories in this project also reminds us that we need to be actively collecting this information, because the way we're responding to something in the moment will be different from the way that we reflect on it in 5 or 10 years. And I have to say, in a lot of ways, conducting those oral histories with members of my community, including my own rabbi. I actually interviewed her at Toro Synagogue about experiences during COVID. There was a sense of connection that I felt in talking and hearing and receiving of the stories in a way that was different from the other modes of communication. So that brings us now to where I am with the Framingham History Center. So I just came on board at the end of May, very beginning of June, and it has been an extraordinary experience. How many of you have been to the Framingham History Center before? A few? Okay, we'll have to get a tour together if you haven't yet. So we are celebrating our 135th anniversary as an institution. So we have the 3 buildings that you see up here on the screen that are anchored around Center Common. We have a 10,000-piece collection, a very active programming and exhibition schedule. And one of the new exhibitions that we're opening is called Collective Journeys, and it's about global migration to Framingham from 1960 to present. And the content that our curator Stacey Goldman is focusing on is the content from oral histories that are recorded with immigrants who came to Framingham. So we have a collection from the late 90s, early 2000s that we're drawing from, and then we're actively collecting oral histories right now of people who have moved to Framingham and their experiences. So as you can see, you know, the channel or the thread of oral histories has really run through my career, and it's something that I'm excited to have us dig into a little bit more today. So I wanted to start with a question, just ask, what does oral history mean to you? When you hear that phrase, what are words or things that come to mind? Yes? Telling a story. Absolutely. Passed down by word of mouth. The l'odor vador, generation to generation. Absolutely. Anything else? Yes?
The word that's coming to my head is unpolished.
Oh, yeah. Unpolished. It's something that hasn't been edited or synthesized, which we all tend to do with our writing, or even, you know, when we draw or create art or practice music. Yeah, I haven't heard that before. I really like that. So oral history. Oh, yes. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, so it's something where, you know, it's the 5-foot fish tale. You know, it's the one where it's not a paper document, it's not a photograph, it's something that people are remembering and recalling, and sometimes that memory has changed over time. Absolutely. Yeah, very fluid is a perfect word for it. Absolutely. So oral history really is all of these things baked into one, and there are the pros and also some of the challenges that come with oral histories, exactly as you've explained. So I'll talk a little bit about oral histories in museums, but I really want to focus on oral histories that we can conduct at home as well. So I like to start with an example of an oral history. So I don't know if you can see it very well on the screen, but this is actually a trunk. And it is a nondescript trunk. I will readily admit that. And it came to us to the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. And you might say, okay, Anna, why did you dedicate this footprint in a small museum to a trunk? One of the reasons why is because this trunk also came with a recorded oral history from the 1970s. So this trunk belonged to Rachmel Shapiro, who in 1905 secreted himself out from Russia, came via Bremerhaven, a port in Germany, and made his way to the United States via Galveston, Texas. And he tells the tale of this harrowing journey in this recording that he made with Lillian Kranitz in 1974. And suddenly the checkpoints that you can read on basically the ship logs and the entry points, they're filled in. Because he didn't just secret himself out of Russia. He talks about he had to escape political oppression. He was part of a political movement, as he put it, that didn't really go so well. So he needed to basically get out of Dodge for all intents and purposes. He talks about arriving at the docks of Galveston in 1905 and being met by 2 missionaries and immediately getting away and sort of moving along on his journey. And so all of these little snippets, these sides, are things that you wouldn't necessarily be able to see if you only looked at just the immigration documents or just looked at the ship log. So suddenly it's transformed from a trunk into a story. It's transformed from a piece of luggage into a tale that starts connecting to immigration and identity and fear and hope and confusion. And so everything that we sort of wrap around objects is something that we need to think about preserving through the spoken word as well. Within the museum fields, the oral histories are often very carefully defined as a recorded interview between an interviewer and an interviewee for the express purpose of adding personal experiences to a historical event. And in a lot of ways, though, I can look at that and say that's something that we need in our historical events in our own lives. We need to add this sort of intentional recording of conversations to the events that take place within our own families as well. Now, oral histories can be many different things, but one of the crucial aspects is that it does include some audio and possibly some audio visual. So it's not just a written document, although often oral histories are transcribed into text. And these are incredibly helpful because if you have an hour-long oral history, it takes a very long time to get through. If you have a transcription, oftentimes you can look for crucial dates or topics or themes that you can go through. But the original content itself is often meant to be composed in audio or visual format. So the stories that are told can range. They can range from stories of Holocaust survivors. They can range from stories of those who lived through the COVID-19 pandemic, but it can also include family histories. It can also include experiences that you had moving. It can involve experiences and memories that you had of your grandmother and what her voice sounded like when she was cooking a certain dish in the kitchen. All of these sort of have that fluid creation between these hard historical events and then the things that kind of make up our lives, the experiences and the emotions and the way that we perceive and that we view them as well. The stories that we often talk about also are wrapped around objects that we keep. Oftentimes, having worked in a historical field for a very long time, people come to me and ask, what do we do with the artifacts or the items that are in our attic? What do we do with the things that are in our basement? Because I don't know how to pass it on. Oral histories are a crucial part of that. Oral histories are a way to look at that object, record a memory that surrounds it, and find a way to preserve that in multiple modes as well. So preserving oral histories can help us preserve items and objects, even if sometimes that physical object might leave our possession, which I know happens in many cases. So there are some principles and guidelines of oral history that I've put up here. One of the first ones and the most important ones is permission and its consent. So when we start an oral history, we always have to ask permission from that person and let them know what we intend to do with the story. And this is something that's important both for the professional side of things, but also the personal. So what we do in the museum field is we have a form that basically states this is what we intend to do with this story that we're recording. It could be for an exhibition or it could be part of a permanent collection, but we detail out what that is. And then we also have them sign and recognize that we'll be keeping these words and records. Now, there's a little bit of a division in the field about whether you offer this or not. I believe very firmly that a person has a right to revoke consent of their word when they choose to. So within our oral histories, there's also the option for someone to come back and say, you know, I don't really want to have that out on public view very much. And we'll talk about that a little bit in the responsibility section. The next principle that I like to talk about is preparation. Preparation is key. And you can imagine going to coffee with someone whom you've never met before, and you sit down and you know nothing about them. The first few questions are going to be pretty awkward. They're going to be a little bit sort of, a little bit dull. But imagine if you go to coffee with someone and you read a story that they told about themselves, or maybe you spent a little bit too much time on Facebook and you looked up different aspects and you saw that they traveled to Sweden the other summer. Suddenly you're able to sit down and you have a few things that you're able to talk about. That's exactly what we do when we record oral histories, is we sit down ahead of time and think, okay, what's my intention in writing this? A lot of times I like to have a goal or a thesis. So here I'm talking with Mauricio Perea, who's one of our board members, and we're recording an oral history for Collective Journeys. And so ahead of time, all of our oral history participants actually get a form where they fill out and they note things like, these are different places that I've lived. Here's some themes or topics that I want to talk about. So if you're recording an oral history with a family member, I highly recommend that you start with a little pre-interview. You sit down and you say, okay, what should we talk about? What are some things that we might want to consider? Or you can start looking at your family tree, have some names pulled up, have some photographs. These are all little conversation starters that can help fill in what the content of the oral history will be. The next thing is structure. So a lot of times in a conversation, we kind of jump around here and there, like we talk about our day and then the weather and then our cousin, and it sort of rambles a little bit. In an oral history, we like to provide space for rambling. Some of the best things that I've recorded have been rambling, but it helps to have a chronological structure or some sort of thematic structure to hang your hat on. A lot of times if you ask someone a wide open question, it can be hard for them to recall a specific instance. So sometimes I like to start with chronology, because a lot of times we sort of think about things through that chronological perspective. So you might say, okay, let's talk about your first memory from school. What was that like? And then suddenly we can start filling in those pieces along the way. But again, just as there's a structure, allowing the conversation to go in a different direction is sometimes the art of oral history. Like, you'll probably have a list of questions that you want to ask, but if something comes up, don't be afraid to sort of pursue it and ask and see where it might take you. And that leads us to an important component, which is responsibility. When people open themselves up to talking with you, that's a level of vulnerability. That's a level of trust that you have built with them, and it's a level of responsibility that you have as an interviewer to make sure that you're thinking about where this conversation might go. I've had instances where someone, once they start talking about personal memories, they really dig into it. And they start talking about things that have hurt them in the past. They talk about ways that they might have intentionally or unintentionally hurt other people. One of the things that I always like to do is, if we're getting into an area that might prove to be painful, that might touch on trauma in any instance, always have an option or a phrase for someone to give you, like, let's go to the next question, or let's take a quick break. Having these phrases ahead of time helps people create space in a way that a person might feel compelled to answer a question that they don't necessarily want to. Another thing that I do like to mention, again, it goes back to permission. At the end of the oral history, asking them afterwards, they have a chance to review it and say, is there anything that you don't want to include in this? You've had a chance to sleep on it, listen to it again. Is there anything that you think, you know what, in the light of day, let's not include what I just said about my cousin? That's also something that we want to be able to invite. Next thing I want to talk about is context. So again, if we're talking about family histories, thinking about it again within the context of national movements, global and international occurrences, or big events. Sometimes I'm just as guilty of this as anyone else. I forget that my parents and my great-grandparents and my great-great-great-grandparents lived through these major events. So sometimes I'm like, oh, wait, can we talk about the Great Depression? Or, oh, that's right, can we talk about this, this movement? What was segregation like? So thinking about the context of these conversations, so you can almost go back and forth between the familiar, the personal, and what's related to your family, and then the bigger context as well. And the last one is care. So again, I think it wraps up a lot of the responsibility, the permissions, and the structure. This is an expression of care. It's an expression of trust. So always enter into it thinking about, how can this oral history help fill out and preserve memories, and how can I I make sure I'm doing this in a way that's careful and responsible and sensitive to what this person is feeling or experiencing as well. So again, these are principles that we can also translate over to when we record personal oral histories. Before we go into that, I want to briefly go into the why behind oral histories. And this is really sort of like my love letter to the importance of oral histories. First of all, it records perspectives that are often excluded. These I should say, archives are very subjective. The way they come together has a lot of variables, and sometimes it depends on what degree you have. It depends on if you happen to be a white man in a certain century. It happened to be how much money you had and how much you were able to contribute to the preservation of materials. Oral histories provide a greater opportunity for more people to contribute their essential experiences and histories in a way that only published materials or only board of director minutes might not necessarily share. Now, this is not exclusive. Oral histories must face some reconciliation and intention with diversity, equity, and inclusion. We can't just throw open the door and say, oh, oral history covers everyone. We have to be intentional and make sure we're looking at our own collections and saying, who's not represented here, and making sure that we're going and building relationships. The next is it records crucial details that you often don't see in written text. These are tones, these are gestures. We often talk about nonverbal communication, but in history, sometimes all we have is written text. And I have to say, I'm so grateful also for any scrap of history that we can pull together. But when there's an opportunity for an oral retelling, oftentimes you're able to see intention in a way that might be misunderstood in text. For one instance, I can say there are two different ways you could hear a certain sentence. You could say, oh, I love going to the dentist. All right, that's one way. Or you could say, oh, I love going to the dentist. That's two totally different meanings, but the same exact words. So oftentimes having an audio or a visual component, you can sort of see how people might feel. You can see where they pause. You can see where their text slows down. You can see where their speech might speed up. And all of that gives you clues to what they're experiencing, what they're feeling, and maybe how they're processing a certain event. Some of the other important things about the why behind oral history, it increases memory and retention. And we've all seen this when we went to high school history classes. How many of us remember every single date that was put in a bullet point and all of the events and the names of the generals and all sorts of things? I don't, and it's my field. But think about how many stories we remember. Think about how suddenly when you talk about an individual, but you talk about the context of it, what was the emotion, what happened, what surprising thing did they encounter? Suddenly you take that story and you carry it with you. And there are certainly studies that have been done that show how stories and narrative increase memory and retention. And we even see this within our own tradition. Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral tradition, the oral law, is something that is carried down from generation to generation. There's a way of memory, a way of preservation that exists in written form, but also exists in the oral tradition as well. Next, it supports communal activity. This is where I get a little nerdy in the science. There was recently an article in Cell, which is a fantastic scientific journal, and it was published in fall of 2021 by Pauline Perez et al. And they reported that there was a, quote, significant correlation of heart rate when subjects are presented with an auditory or audiovisual narrative. So what that means, stories help synchronize our heart rates. And it was I highly recommend reviewing the study as well. They actually did it with people separated in different rooms across time as well. But sharing stories is a communal activity. It's something that brings us together. There are other studies that show that sharing a story, both the giving and the receiving of a story, releases oxytocin, which is a neurochemical that is responsible for building empathy and helps us make connections and engage. So suddenly oral histories are not just a texts, they're a way of building community. They're a way of bringing us together and engaging in a way that we might not otherwise experience. And finally, and we'll get back to this in just a second, it maps out our narratives and our stories. It maps out the order of the story that we choose to tell. And it maps out what do we consider important in our memory and what do we might not necessarily consider important. So I want us to talk a little bit about how do you start with an oral history. So we've talked about some of the principles, we talked about the why, but one of the best ways to start an interview, and I know it looks like a joke, but I promise it's not, it's actually to interview yourself. Because a lot of times it is an interesting experience to be asked questions and to respond. So I always like to have a practice of someone interviewing me to practice it. If you don't have that though, you can actually interview yourself. And as you do this, consider how to preserve the story. So all you need is a simple audio recorder. So a lot of our phones have voice memos. There are apps that you can get. It's really surprising the quality of audio that you can get. And an easy interview that you could start with is asking yourself about an object in your home. So you can go home, maybe it's, the Sunday or, a Thursday night or something, and you can look around your house and find one object that has some sort of history or meaning to you. So you can turn on the audio recorder, get a cup of tea, sit down with the object, and begin the audio recording by stating your name, the date, and a brief overview about what you're doing. This is a crucial step in any oral history. I know there's an impulse to jump right in, but you will thank yourself if you always start your recordings with your name, your date, and a brief line of context. So if it's audio, take a moment to describe the object. If it's a teacup, describe the weight of it, the shape of it. What is the color of it? Is there a material to it? And this helps sort of get you warmed up to then ask yourself, what memories do I have around it? What's the first time I remember holding this object? What is the meaning that I have? Why do I still have this thing? Ask those questions of yourself. Give yourself an opportunity to pause. The voice memo, there's so much space on your phone. Actually, there's not a ton of space on my phone, but there's probably, we can make space on our phone. So allow the pauses, allow a little bit of time. And then the fourth step, once you've been able to record it, is first of all, I love backing up audio. So you can save it to your computer, you can save it to the cloud. And if you feel like it, you can share it with someone. But also, you don't have to. Your stories and your experiences are valid, even if you're the only one who hears it. So I want to go over, before we have a quick sort of workshop to practice it, I want to go over how oral histories tie into storytelling and Passover. So what you see on your screen right now is a Haggadah, and it was donated to the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience by the Dobby family. And the Dobby family, it was specifically Albert Dobby. He escaped in 1937 to the United States, and he settled in Ardmore, Oklahoma. Believe it or not, this is one of the only pre-Holocaust possessions that actually survived the Holocaust. And the family retained it, and it's on view right now in the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. And this is one of my, I shouldn't have favorite artifacts, it's one of my favorite artifacts, because it's both a story and of a story as well. So Passover, again, is no better time to talk about the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that we tell each other. Haggadah means telling. So it is telling, it is a storytelling. The Haggadah is the telling of a collective oral history that we're passing down from generation to generation. That is something that gains new light and new sort of glinting in perspective and meaning from the years that it's passed down. Stories also are very subjective, and they're subjective in the order that we choose to tell them. So stories are subjective, and I mentioned this very briefly earlier, both in what we choose to include. So when we have a whole data set, we only choose to include certain elements, certain conversations, certain events, certain things that happen to us, and what we leave on the cutting room floor is a decision that we make. But it's also a decision in terms of what order do we want to tell the story? There's often the joke that you can tell if a play is a tragedy or a comedy based off of whether it ends with a funeral or with a wedding. The same goes for Passover. What if it had ended with that 10th plague? What if it had been a tone that didn't include the Exodus or the songs of praise that followed? See how that changes the tone just by shifting the transition point. The story also continued after it. I mean, we're here. But there was a transition point that concluded the end of our retelling. Seder itself means order. It's the order of the telling that we have. And so we can consider, when we think about Passover, what is the order that we tell our stories about ourselves and to ourselves? I also like it in that it's not just a story, but we have a very specific time when we're supposed to recall the story. It's not just the order, but it's when we tell it. Passover is powerful because it also says there is an imperative that at a specific time we come back and we tell that story again. We can start thinking about our own stories in our life. What stories are we telling ourselves, consciously or subconsciously, about our own history? Do we have a narrative that we've been telling ourselves over and over that we pull out at certain times? And maybe it's accurate. Maybe it's a story that we want to retell in a different way. I always love that Passover ends with the imperative, next year in Jerusalem. There's the implication, we will tell the order of the story next year, where? In Jerusalem. So now I want to move to a quick workshop. I think we had a few different questions, and we might shorten it just a little bit, but I want you to practice asking stories of each other. And so it's going to be very brief, and we're going to try a couple of different prompts. So the first prompt, and this is a challenge, it's a speed challenge, is I'm not sure if we're able to pair up in two. I think we might be able to pair up in two, but just take a moment, and in 1 minute with your partner, I want you to tell the story of how you came to Framingham. And I know this is painful. You're like, okay, I need an hour, but try to do it in just a minute. So I'll give us a moment if we want to rearrange and choose our partners, or we can count off if we like. And those of you who are on Zoom, if you're with someone in the room, I invite you to also ask this question of each other. Or if you're watching on your own, ask that question of yourself. All right, I know I'm cruel for cutting short the conversations that are going on right now. All right, so before I ask some questions, going back to that permission and consent, this is being recorded, I believe, is that correct, Bill? So this is being recorded, so if I ask you a question, if you answer, please let me know if you give permission for us to record your answer. So the first thing I'll do will be a nonverbal response, but out of curiosity, just by a show of hands, how many of you started your story 5 years ago or sooner? Okay, a few of us. I would have as well. Okay. How many of you started your story 40 years or sooner? Okay, a couple. Yeah. How many of you started your story a next generation back, or talked about a parent or a grandparent? There you go. See, and this is again that beauty of where do you start the story? Where does it begin as well? I love that. Would one person like to share again very briefly their story to Framingham?
My parents lived in Springfield, Mass. My late husband was in business at that time in Springfield, Mass. And then he was called back to the Boston headquarters. And so we got in the car from Springfield and we drove an hour and a half, which was as far as I thought I could go from Springfield, Mass. And we stopped in That's how we came to Framingham, Mass.
I love that story. Thank you so much, Ellie. And suddenly you can start thinking of all the follow-up conversations, like what's the longest road trip you've taken since then? And what were your first thoughts of Framingham? And even that's the way, again, that conversation can go. So thank you so much for sharing that. So I will let you know I had a few additional questions. Is it okay if we run 5 minutes past 8 o'clock, or okay? I'll be brief with that. The other questions that I was going to take the journey with you through is, what is a food or recipe that reminds you of home? The questions that you see, there are sort of three-part questions. These are ones that gradually increase in terms of sort of centering a feeling of meaning or nostalgia. So let me ask, and again, if you speak, just know this is being recorded. Would someone like to raise their hand and tell me a food that reminds them of home?
Yeah, all the way around.
The food that reminds me of home there really are the recipes for Rosh Hashanah. So it includes my mother's chicken soup and her kugel. But most of all, and no one does this anymore, but she used to render the chicken fat, and it's called gribenas. And if I smell that in my house now, and I still do it, I don't eat it necessarily, but I do it to honor her every Rosh Hashanah.
Thank you for sharing that. That was beautiful. And again, we talked about food, but suddenly there was a connection to memory. There was a connection to a person who's very influential and instrumental. This was a question that I also asked at the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. We had a foodways section, and I had a little recipe box where people could draw or write a certain recipe. And again, this is going away from the oral history, but into the storytelling. And the stories that people would share in there were, some of them literally brought me to tears. Stories about there was a matzo ball recipe that someone learned because their friend was passing away. And they learned it from their mother, and they made it as a source of comfort for that person. The person passed away, and they continue to make that recipe because it connects them to that individual. The last one I was going to ask you is, what is a time when you felt brave? These are qualitative questions. You know, these are questions that you might not expect in a history book, but they're imperative when we start getting at the heart of what are the things that we're recalling day to day? What are the things that we aren't recalling day to day? And again, it's about not only the order, but when we choose to bring out that story and retell it. And I'll very briefly say, if you'll allow me to share a story myself, one story that I call to mind again and again is I had the opportunity to through hike the Appalachian Trail. I went from Georgia to Maine. And by the time I got to Maine, I was tired. I was mentally tired. I was physically tired. I looked tired. And I had a 6-month leave of absence from my work. My sister was getting married, and I had a very short amount of time to get to Mount Katahdin in Maine. And I had to hustle. And I was exhausted because I was hiking 14, 15, 16 hours a day in really rough terrain. And I got to a certain point, and not only was I exhausted, I happened to get norovirus, which was going along the trail. And you can imagine. So one morning I woke up and I had it, and I thought, what is this going to do to my mileage? I looked at the map, and I was standing at the base of Crocker Mountain, which was almost a 1,000-foot elevation per mile increase, which is pretty steep. And I stood there, and I thought, there is no way I'm getting up that mountain. And I looked at the very top. I said, nope, not a chance. And then I looked halfway down the mountain, and I was like, can I get there? No, absolutely no chance whatsoever. I went 10 feet up. Can I get there? Nope. And so I looked down at my feet, and I said, could I get one step up? I thought, I could probably do that before keeling over. So I took a step up. I repeated that process up the entire mountain. And I compared when I got to that top of the mountain, and I later was able to get into town and rest and recover, and I successfully completed it, thank goodness. But I recall myself standing at the base of that mountain Whenever I need to remind myself, this is what it feels like to be brave. I have taken that story out like it's an object and looked at it. All these moments where I thought, how am I going to do this? How am I going to get through it? So stories that we preserve, oral histories, both that we tell others and that we tell ourselves, are tools that we can bring out and ask again and again at just the right minute. So, around the Seder table, here's something that I would love to give you as a little bit of homework as we're all preparing for Pesach coming up. I challenge you or invite you to see if your party is open to recording a short 10 to 15 minute oral history around the Seder table. So on the left-hand side are some very basic rules. First one, ask if everyone's okay with it. And you could just say, all right, I want to try this thing. There was this lady, she was going on, there was like a mountain and I don't know, can I record it? So if everyone says okay, get out a simple audio recorder or a phone, put it on the table right next to the Seder plate. You can do a couple of tests just to make sure it's recording and that the levels are right. And then go around the table and each person, have them say their own name. And then end with the date and the occasion, or you can begin with it. And after that, you can save and share. And what I provided on the right-hand side are my recommendations for the 4 questions, the oral history questions for Passover. The first question, of course, is, will you let us record this? The second question can be, what is an event that happened this year that holds some meaning for you? What's an event that jumps out to you? The third question, what story would you like to tell about a family member or friend who is no longer present here? The oral histories create living memories. And then the fourth question, ask each other, what question should we ask ourselves each year? Decide this together. See if there's one question that you want to start asking every single Passover. And so you get out the oral history recording, you ask the same question, and start seeing how that story might shift over time. See how you might shift and change over time. And then every Passover, record that question. Maybe sometime during the year, you're welcome to transcribe it or pick out highlights. After you've answered the question for the year, you can start laughing about things that you responded in the previous years. But look at how your own oral history builds over time. And I can guarantee you that that oral history that you record year after year will become one of the most priceless things that you have in your possession. So thank you for granting me the time and the opportunity to talk about oral histories with you. It's been such a joy, and I'm looking forward to many, many more conversations. So I would love to hear if there are questions or comments in the chat, anything that came up with your own conversations at home. We would love to see them.
First of all, Anna, thank you so much. Wow, just beautiful to think about how we might capture these oral histories at home. I'm curious if you have any guidelines or tips for, you mentioned briefly follow-up questions, right? That there might be something that comes up. I sometimes find in preparation, you can have your 5 questions that you make sure you want to ask, and then it goes in a totally different direction, and that night you're thinking, oh, I really wish that I had asked this question. So any tips for, in the moment, sort of staying with a person, figuring out where to take the oral history?
That's such a great question. And I think it goes back to sort of there's that structure and then sort of the play area. For me, when I have questions, if I know there's a certain objective that I need to ask, a lot of times I'll have those questions and I will also share it with the person I'm talking to. A lot of times the people I'm interviewing keep me so honest about, weren't we going to talk about this, or shouldn't we say something along this line? The other thing that you can do that is not necessarily a common practice, but I think it should be, is go ahead and plan a 30-minute follow-up afterwards. How great would it be if we record oral histories and then we have another date on the books in a week or two that says, hey, let's reflect on questions. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we haven't, or there are some questions that I wanted to ask that have come to me, and I'd love to ask them as well. And then one of my favorite questions to also ask is there anything that you wish I had asked you? And that often will bring out a story that had been like on the tip of their tongue that they had wanted to tell, and that like I just hadn't asked the right question for it. So sometimes that question can often bring it out. Yeah.
I'm a fellow AT hiker, by the way. Not all of it,
fabulous.
but a section hiker. So
That's awesome.
Very exciting. I'm thinking about my Seder happening in a few weeks and some kids who will be there. And I'm thinking have you ever sort of tried doing something like this with a mixed group of different ages, and how do you sort of make kids feel included? Yeah.
Kids ask the best questions. They really do, and sometimes they have the best responses. So one of the ways to do it is sort of like having a combination of some of the meaning questions, but then also have a combination of things that start getting kids excited about talking. So if you have really little tykes, you can ask questions like, what's a joke you like? And that just gets them talking, and sometimes maybe talking too much, but it gets them talking. But then you can start asking middle ages, what's a question you wish you could ask a great-grandparent? And sometimes that question can spark an idea. And again, it's keeping it open. It's keeping it sort of simple. A lot of times I might leave out some of the meaning, like the word meanings, because they're like, what are you talking about? And sort of drilling it back into hypothetical questions. And then sometimes having anything related to food or play or travel or experience, that can also be a way to get kids very involved. I would say once it's, 3rd to 5th grade, there are some questions that kids really, kids always, I should say they don't surprise me anymore because they can handle some great questions. And maybe a week ahead of time, you could poll them and say, hey, we're going to do this fun challenge. Can you come up with a question? It's almost like finding the Afikoman, like come up with a question to ask around the Seder table and see if there's something that they might want to ask. So that might be a few things, but yeah. All right, well, thank you again. It's been a joy to be here, so thanks.